Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Shivering Mouse. I've actually been having a little computer trouble last night and this morning, so today's Narnia episode is actually going to be read on film for you. That way you still get that content. I didn't want to leave kind of a cliffhanger of Shasta running out of the hermit's place and out into the desert alone and having no continuation of that story, because as a reader, that's something that would frustrate me to death. That would drive me crazy. So I wanted to continue with the story, and if Friday my computer's still being fussy, I'll probably do Friday's episode on Disney over video as well. Just that way everybody still gets their content. If you're listening on SoundCloud and Stitcher and stuff, those guys may not have as much access to this. They'll have to go to Patreon to watch it. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and keep on cranking out the content on the same schedule. As usual, there will be a little bit less editing as far as the ums and uhs, because it's harder to do that with video than it is with audio. But for the most part, I'm going to try and keep things on schedule and going about the same way they normally do, so that we can continue our adventures the way we usually do together. With that being said, we're going to start Chapter 11, The Unwelcome Fellow Traveler. When Shasta went through the gate, he found a slope of grass and a little heather running up before him into some trees. He had nothing to think about now, and no plans to make. He had only to run, and that was quite enough. His limbs were shaking, and a terrible stitch was beginning in his side, and the sweat that kept dropping into his eyes blinded him and made them smart. He was unsteady on his feet, too. More than once he nearly turned an ankle on a loose stone. The trees were thicker now than they had yet been, and in the more open spaces there was bracken. The sun had gone in without making it any cooler. It had become one of those hot, gray days when there seemed to be twice as many flies as usual. Shasta's face was covered with them. He did not even try to shake them off. He had too much else to do. Suddenly he heard a horn. Not a great big throbbing horn like the horns in Tashbaan, but a merry call. Tree-do-do-do-do-do-do. Next moment he came into a wide glade and found himself in a crowd of people. At least, it looked like a crowd to him. In reality, there were about 15 or 20 of them, all gentlemen in green hunting dress with their horses, some in the saddle and some standing by their horses' heads. In the center, someone was holding the stirrup for a man to mount, and the man he was holding it for was the jolliest, fattest, most apple-cheeked, twinkling-eyed king you could imagine. As soon as Shasta came in sight, this king forgot all about mounting his horse. He spread out his arms to Shasta, his face lit up, and he cried out in a great, deep voice that seemed to come from the bottom of his chest, "Corin, my son!" And on foot, and in rags. "What? No," said Shasta, panting, shaking his head. "Not Prince Corin. I know I'm like him. I saw his highness in Tashbaan. He sent his greetings." The king was staring at Shasta with an extraordinary expression on his face. "Are you King Loon?" gasped Shasta, and then, without waiting for an answer, "Lord King, fly, Anvard, shut the gates, enemies upon you, Rapidash and 200 horse." Have you assurance of this, boy?" asked one of the other gentlemen. "My own eyes," said Shasta. "I've seen them, raced them all the way from Tashbaan." "On foot?" said the gentleman, raising his eyebrows a little. "Horses." "With the hermit," said Shasta. "Question him no more, Darren," said King Loon. "I can see the truth in his face. We must ride for it, gentlemen. A spare horse, there, for the boy. Can you ride fast, friend?" For answer, Shasta put his foot into the stirrup of the horse which had been led towards him, and a moment later he was in the saddle. He had done it 100 times with Bree in the last few weeks, and his mounting was very different now from what it had been on that first night, when Bree said that he climbed up the horse as if he were climbing a haystack. He was pleased to hear Lord Darren say to the king, "The boy has a true horseman's seat, sire. I warrant there's noble blood in him." "His blood. Aye, there's the point," said the king. He stared hard at Shasta again with a curious expression, almost hungry, in his steady gray eyes. But now the whole party was moving off in a brisk canter. Shasta's seat was excellent, but he was sadly puzzled as to what to do with his reins, for he had never touched the reins while he was on Bree's back. But he looked very carefully out of the corners of his eyes to see what the others were doing, as some of us have done at parties when we aren't quite sure which knife or fork we were meant to use. And he tried to get his fingers right. He didn't dare try to really direct the horse. He trusted it would follow the rest. The horse was, of course, an ordinary horse, not a talking horse, but it had quite enough of its wits to realize that the strange boy on its back had no whip, no spurs, and was not really the master of the situation. That's why Shasta soon found himself at the tail end of the procession. Even so, he was going pretty fast. There were no flies now, and the air on his face was delicious. He had got his breath back, too, and his errand had succeeded. For the first time since the arrival at Tashman, how long ago it seemed, he was beginning to enjoy himself. He looked up to see how much nearer the tops of the mountains had become. To his disappointment, he could not see them at all, only a vague grayness rolling down towards them. He had never been in mountain country before, and he was surprised. "It's a cloud," he said to himself, "a cloud coming down. I see. Up here in the hills one is really in the sky. I shall see what the inside of a cloud is like. What fun! I've often wondered." Far away on his left, and a little behind him, the sun was getting ready to set. They had come to a rough kind of road by now, and were making very good speed, but Shasta's horse was still the last of the lot. Once or twice, when the road made a bend, there was now a continuous forest on each side of it, he lost sight of the others for a second or two. Then they plunged into fog, or else fog rolled over them. The world became gray. Shasta had not realized how cold and wet the inside of a cloud could be, nor how dark. The gray turned black with alarming speed. Someone at the head of the column winded the horn every now and then, and each time the sound came from a little further off. He couldn't see any of the others now, but of course he'd be able to as soon as he got around the next bend. But when he rounded it, he still couldn't see them. In fact, he couldn't see anything at all. His horse was walking now. "Get on, horse, get on," said Shasta. Then came the horn, very faint. Bree had always told him that he must keep his heels well turned out, and Shasta had got the idea that something very terrible would happen if he dug his heels into the horse's sides. This seemed to him an occasion for trying it. "Look here, horse," he said, "if you don't buck up, do you know what I'll do? I'll dig my heels into you. I really will." The horse, however, took no notice of his threat, so Shasta settled himself firmly into the saddle, gripped with his knees, clenched his teeth, and punched both of the horse's sides with his heels as hard as he could. The only result was that the horse broke into a kind of pretense of a trot for about 5 or 6 paces, and then subsided into a walk again. And now it was quite dark, and they seemed to have given up blowing that horn. The only sound was a steady drip, drip, drip from the branches of trees. "Well, I suppose even a walk will get us somewhere sometime," said Shasta to himself. "Only I hope I shan't run into Prince Rabidash and his people." He went on for what seemed like a long time, always at a walking pace. He began to hate that horse, and he also began to feel very hungry. Presently he came upon a place where the road divided in two. He was just wondering which way led to Anvard when he was startled by a noise from behind him. It was the noise of trotting horses. "Rabidash," he thought. He had no way of guessing which road Rabidash would take, but if I take one, said Shasta to himself, he may take the other, and if I stay at the crossroads, I'm sure to be caught. He dismounted and led his horse as quickly as he could down the right-hand road. The sound of the cavalry grew rapidly nearer, and in a minute or two Shasta realized that they were at the crossroads. He held his breath waiting to see which way they would take. There came a low word of command, "Halt!" and then a moment of horsey noises, nostrils blowing, hoofs pawing, bits being champed, and necks being patted. Then a voice spoke. "Attend, all of you. We are now within a furlong of the castle. Remember your orders. Once we are in Narnia, as we should be by sunrise, you are to kill as little as possible. On this venture you are to regard every drop of Narnian blood as more precious than a gallon of your own. On this venture, I say. The gods will send us a happier hour when you must leave nothing alive between Cair Paravel and the western waste. But we are not yet in Narnia. Here in Archenland it is another thing. In the assault on this castle of King Lune's, nothing matters but speed. Show your mettle. It must be mine within an hour, and if it is, I'll give it all to you. I reserve no booty for myself. Kill me every barbarian male within its walls, down to the child that was born yesterday, and everything else is yours to divide as you please, the women, the gold, the jewels, the weapons, and the wine. The man that I see hanging back when we come to the gates shall be burned alive. In the name of Tash, the irresistible, the inexorable, forward!" And with a great clippity-clop the column began to move, and Shasta breathed again. They had taken the other road. Shasta thought they took a long time going past, for though he had been talking and thinking about 200 horse all day, he had not realized how many they really were. But as the last sound died away, and once more he was alone amid the drip, drip, drip from the trees. He now knew the way to Anvard, but of course he could not go there. That would mean running into the arms of Rabidash's troopers. "What on earth am I to do?" said Shasta to himself. but he remounted his horse and continued along the road he had chosen, in the faint hope that finding some cottage where he might ask for shelter and maybe a meal. He had thought, of course, that going back to Aravis and Bree and Hwyn at the Hermitage, but he couldn't because now he had not the least idea of the direction. After all, said Shasta, this road is bound to get somewhere. But that all depends on what you mean by somewhere. The road kept on getting to somewhere in the sense that it got to more and more trees, all dark and dripping, and to colder and colder air, and strange icy winds kept blowing the mist past him, though they never blew it away. He had been used to the mountain... if he had been used to the mountain country, he would have realized that this meant that he was now very high up, perhaps right at the top of the pass. But Shasta knew nothing of mountains. I do think, said Shasta, that I must be the most unfortunate boy that ever lived in the world. Everything goes right for everyone except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies got off safe from Tashban. I was left behind. Aravis and Bree and Wyn are all snug as anything with that old hermit, and of course I was the one sent on. King Lune and his people must have gotten to safety of their castle and shut the gates long before Rabidash arrived, but I got left out. And being very tired and having nothing inside him, he felt so sorry for himself that the tears rolled down his cheeks. What put that to the stop was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone, or somebody, was walking beside him. It was pitch dark, and he could not see anything. The thing, or person, was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale, and Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature. He had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he had really no idea how long it had been there, and it was a horrible shock. It darted into his mind that he had heard a long time ago that there were giants in these northern countries. He bit his lip in terror, but now that he really had something to cry about, he had stopped crying. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta had begun to hope that he had only imagined it. But just as he was becoming quite sure, there came suddenly a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be imagination. Anyway, he had felt the hot breath of that sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, he would have risked everything in a breakaway and a wild gallop, but he knew he couldn't make that horse gallop, so he went on at walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he could bear it no longer. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. Are you a giant?" asked Shasta. "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I am not like the creatures you call giants." "I can't see you at all," said Shasta, after staring very hard. Then, for an even more terrible idea had come into his head, he said, almost in a scream, You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please, please do go away. What harm have I ever done to you? Oh, I am the unluckiest person in the world." Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and face. "There," it said, "that is not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows." Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, so he told how he had never known his real father nor mother, and had been brought up sternly by the fishermen. And then he told the story of his escape, and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and of all of their other dangers in Tashban, and about his night among the tombs, and how the beasts had howled at him out of the desert. And he told him of the heat and the thirst and the desert journey, and how they were almost to their goal when another lion chased them and wounded Aravis, and also how long it had been since he had had anything to eat. "I do not call you unfortunate," said the large voice. "Well, don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?" said Shasta. "There was only one lion," said the voice. "What on earth do you mean? I've just told you there was at least 2 the first night, and—" "There was only one, but he was swift of foot." "How do you know?" "I was the lion." And as Shasta gaped with an open mouth and said nothing, the voice continued. "I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for that last mile so that you could reach King Lune on time. I was the lion you do not remember, who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death. so that it came to shore where a man sat, wakeful at midnight, to receive you. Then it was you who wounded Aravis. It was I. But what for? Child, said the voice, I am telling you your story, not hers. I tell no one's any story but his own. Who are you? Said Shasta. Myself, said the voice, very deep and low, so the earth shook again. Myself, loud and clear and gay, and then a third time. Myself, whispered so softly you could hardly see it, yet it seemed to come from all around you, as if leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid that the voice belonged to something that would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, but a whole new sort of trembling came over him. Yet he felt glad, too. The mist was turning from black to gray, and from gray to white. This must have begun to happen some time ago, but while he had been talking to the thing, he had not been able to notice anything else. Now the whiteness around him became a shining whiteness, and his eyes began to blink. Somewhere ahead he could hear birds singing. He knew that the night was over at last, and he could see the mane and ears and head of his horse quite easily now. A golden light fell on them from the left. He thought it was the sun. He turned, and he saw pacing beside him, taller than a horse, a lion. The horse did not seem to be afraid of it, or else could not see it. It was from the lion that the light came, and no one saw anything more terrible or beautiful. Luckily, Shasta had lived all of his life too far south in Calormen to have heard the tales that were whispered in Tashbaan about the dreadful Narnian demon that appeared in the form of a lion, and of course he knew none of the stories about Aslan, the great lion, the son of the Emperor beyond the sea, the High King above all kings of Narnia. But after one glance at the lion's face, he slipped out of the saddle and fell at its feet. He couldn't say anything, but then he didn't want to say anything, and he knew he needn't say anything. The High King above all kings stooped towards him. Its mane and some strange, solemn perfume that hung about the mane was all around him. It touched his forehead with his tongue, and he lifted his face, and their eyes met. Then, instantly, in the pale brightness of the mist, and the fiery brightness of the lion, rolled themselves together into swirling glory, gathered themselves up, and disappeared, and he was alone with the horse on the grassy hillside, under a blue sky, and there were birds singing. The next chapter is called Shasta in Narnia, and we'll learn more about, the four Pevensies, Lucy, Edmund, Susan, and Peter, and we'll get to see more talking animals besides horses for the first time in this story. So I'm super excited to get to it with you guys next week, and thank you so much for tuning in.